Nihon Falcom's Trails series might just be the platonic ideal of a cult classic JRPG franchise. Developed by a small studio with little international recognition that nonetheless has been around since it helped pioneer the genre in the first place back in the 80s, the series has told one single interconnected story in an ever-expanding setting across 2 decades and 13 entries and counting. This of course makes it very difficult to begin playing the series in the first place, as it can seem very overwhelming to an outsider, and there's always been discourse about how to recommend new players start. When beginning a long-running series like this, a good place to begin is of course the very beginning, but a big problem arises with that. The accessibility of the 3 Trails in the Sky games, known to fans as the Loburl arc, and the entire first storyline of the series that inadvertently set the grounds for every game to come. They're all on PC, but beyond that, the only platforms they're playable on are PlayStation ones almost as old as the games themselves. And so, in order to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the series, Falcom has attempted to solve this problem by completely remaking the original Trails in the Sky game from the ground up in their modern 3D engine, releasing it for PS5, Switch 1, Switch 2, and Steam just last week. I'm a massive Trails fan who started with the original Trails in the Sky, and thanks to GungHo Entertainment, I was provided with a review code, and then proceeded to do basically everything you can possibly do in the game. And now I'm going to make that your problem, because I'm here to give you as spoiler-free and comprehensive a review as I possibly can, while trying to answer 3 very important questions. Is this a good game? Is this a good remake of the original Trails in the Sky? And is this a good starting point for newcomers to the Trails series? In short, my answer to all 3 questions is yes, with asterisks of varying sizes on each yes, but regardless, I can wholeheartedly recommend it, not just to people who've had their interest piqued by trailers and the demo for this remake, but anyone who's been interested in trying out the Trails series as a whole, and was unsure on how to take the first step. If that's all you needed to hear to be convinced to give the game a try, and you don't care about my extended yapping to follow, there's a free demo that covers the first 6 to 8 hours of the remake, and the original game should be on sale for $10 US as we speak, so there really is nothing stopping you from getting started and getting sucked in instead of listening to me prattle on for the rest of the video. This is one of those rare cases where I can say that the original game didn't need to be remade in the first place, but that's not a knock against the remake that ended up being made in any way. The problem with just directing any new players to the original Sky games was never an issue of their quality or how well they aged. The issue is that many people interested in Trails are console-only players, and while almost the entire rest of the series has been comprehensively ported to PS4, PS5, and Switch, the very beginning has been effectively PC-locked the entire time. Falcom could have just remastered the original Sky games and then released those for multiple platforms, but they instead developed an entire remake of the original game, very heavily hinting that they're planning on doing the other 2 in the future, that I think can best be described as absurdly faithful, sometimes even to a fault, that results in there not really being a definitive version of the game. While returning players get the blast of nostalgia and get to experience the original game in a brand new light, and new players get to jump in with a big hype wave, while also experiencing the beginning of the series with Falcom's best production values I think they've ever done, new players in the future get the opportunity to pick and choose the method in which they want to experience Trails in the Sky, and there is no wrong answer to that choice, with even playing both versions being just as valid as choosing original or remake. The story of Trails in the Sky begins with an energetic 11-year-old girl named Estelle Bright waiting for her father Cassius to come home. When he arrives, he's carrying a bundle that he tries to pass off as a present for his daughter, which turns out to be a very injured, mysterious and aloof boy by the name of Joshua, who eventually gets adopted and is raised alongside Estelle for the next 5 years. The game proper begins on the day Estelle and Joshua are set to take the final exam to become Junior Bracers, members of an international non-governmental organization tasked with solving requests from people who need help, keeping the peace, and protecting civilians above all else, an organization that Cassius is a member of. The Trails series is set on a continent called Zemuria, one containing dozens of nations and countless cultures, though as far as this game goes, you don't really need to concern yourself with a whole lot of that. Compared to the widening scope of later games, Trails in the Sky tells a very quaint and cozy tale of 2 young people coming of age as they learn more about themselves, each other, and the nation they're tasked with protecting as they travel around it on foot. The Brights reside in the Kingdom of Loburl, a relatively small nation taking up the southwest corner of the continent, sandwiched between the two major powers of Western Zamuria, the Calvard Republic to the east, and the expansionist Erebonian Empire to the north. Another thing important to the themes of the series overall is the rapid progression of technology. Zamuria is only half a century out from an industrial revolution sparked by the rediscovery of ancient magitech, and the new devices called orbments, which use a completely clean form of energy called orbal energy, inform every single facet of life in Liberl and other countries on the continent that we see later on in the series, and that all starts here. Erebonia attempted to invade Liberl 10 years ago, a campaign that only failed because of Liberl's technological superiority and the last-minute advent of the combat airship. Scars of this war still run deep throughout the entire kingdom, a conflict that claimed the life of Estelle Bright's mother, as she sacrificed herself to protect her daughter, who now wants to protect other people like her mother did, this time as a bracer, with her boundless infectious energy dragging Joshua along for the ride, as he tries to keep her out of danger and act as the brains of the operations. People who have played other Trails games later in the series, and are much more used to competent, responsible Estelle, are certainly going to be in for a surprise when you see just how stupid and hot-headed she is as a rookie, and we love her for that. Estelle is a wonderful protagonist that it's always a joy to follow, and Joshua is a great foil for her and deuteragonist in his own right. Throughout their journey across Liberl's 5 major regions, they'll be joined by a rotating cast of 3rd and 4th party members, as their paths, or perhaps even trails, one might say, to explore and learn and prove themselves worthy of becoming full-fledged senior bracers, intersect and sometimes run alongside those of other people they encounter on the way. This game has the smallest party size in the entire series, one that's kind of become known for having massive casts in recent entries, and that just helps the vibes immensely. Simple, cozy, quaint, rustic, charming, and even slice-of-lifey are all adjectives you can use to describe both the original Trails in the Sky and this remake. And while the slow pace and large amounts of dialogue that exist just to expand the world and provide more flavor to the setting might be a turnoff for some, people who want to get immersed in a richly detailed world in a way that I've never seen done in video games anywhere else are going to be in for a treat. This is the kind of game where you'll be rewarded more than any other for talking to every single NPC every time you enter a new area, NPCs that almost universally get new dialogue after every single significant story beat. It is purely optional, but if you want your gameplay loop to involve seeing a major cutscene, then getting all the new side quests you've unlocked, and then doing your rounds and talking to everyone you can to see what new things they have to say, that is something you can absolutely do, and you will be rewarded for it. Every NPC has their own life and their own little storyline that they're going through, while Estelle and Joshua are dealing with the actual plot of the game. Each of the game's 5 chapters, don't be fooled by 2 of them being called prologue and finale, they're just as long as the other chapters, puts you in a different region of the kingdom and gives you a brand new cast of NPCs to get to know and love, as they go through their own little arcs during the story of each chapter, and some recurring characters, both players in the story and completely innocuous minor NPCs, show up in multiple regions across multiple chapters as they go about their own business around Liberl. The remake makes all this talking to NPCs significantly easier and smoother, as well as avoiding any permanently missable content a lot easier too, because they have the minimap system from more recent entries in the series that clearly indicates where side quests can be obtained outside of going to each region's Bracer Guild branch, as well as a separate icon for things like conversations that give you permanently missable items, or small optional story-related scenes that can only be viewed at certain points in time. On top of that, the minimap icons for NPCs change color when they no longer have any new dialogue for you, so actually seeing what everyone has to say all the time is much more feasible in the remake compared to the original game, in which you pretty much just had to guess and check. Throughout your adventure, you can collect volumes of an in-universe novel that, yes, you are able to read, and yes, eventually does come around as relevant to the story of later games in the series, and you can eventually turn in a complete set of volumes for Estelle and Joshua's ultimate weapons. The thing about this is, you can only get the volumes by talking to specific NPCs at very specific points in the story. This was complete guesswork in the original game, and while the points in time and methods of obtaining each volume is exactly the same in the remake, you get icons, so instances like having to go to the exact opposite side of a region right at the beginning of a chapter when Estelle and Joshua are just about to leave for another region through a gate on the entire opposite side of the map is much easier because you can see where you need to go, and fast travel is added so you can go there almost instantly instead of just having to walk for several minutes. On top of that, at the end of every chapter, shops will begin to sell every single volume of the book available during that chapter, albeit at a major markup, so it's a lot harder to miss out if you're trying to complete the set. This entire talk about talking to every NPC after every story beat is something that will only appeal to a certain kind of player, and you might think that it will massively inflate your playtime of the game, and yes, that's 100% true, but when I say that my entire playthrough took almost 80 hours, that is significantly longer than most people will take to get through the game. I played on the highest difficulty, which is a lot harder than it's been in a lot of recent games in the series, so that instantly made battles take a whole lot longer. I did talk to every NPC after every story beat. I also did every single side quest, and then on top of that, I platinumed the game, which means doing every single achievement. One of which involved beating the final boss again after a New Game Plus run, and another involved completing every in-game reward task, many of which involved grinding far above and beyond what you would need to do to actually finish the game in a more casual playthrough. Plus, I did a lot of just looking around and enjoying the views in this new version of Liberl, so I'm pretty confident in saying that while yes, this game is longer than the original, it would be pretty reasonable to say a brand new player, not necessarily talking to everyone, maybe skipping a few side quests and playing on a lower difficulty, would get done in between 40 and 50 hours, when the original game very comfortably sat at high 30s to low 40s. Most of this comes from voice acting and more choreography being added to scenes, and not from brand new content. This is almost as direct a remake as I've ever seen. There are, by my count, 7 new side quests in the remake, and besides that and dialogue surrounding gameplay mechanics that are different in this version, the entire story is identical to that of the original, to the point where the Japanese script is virtually the same as it was in 2004. This isn't trying to reinvent or reimagine Trails in the Sky, it is an adaptation of the original game to a new graphic style and gameplay formula. There are a couple instances of cutscenes being subtly changed to include things that were expanded on in later games, such as flashbacks showing characters that were not invented in the original Sky games and stuff like that, but the story is the same. If you finish the remake of the first Trails in the Sky and just want to continue the series, you can pick up the original Trails in the Sky second chapter without waiting for its remake, and pick up the story from there with absolutely zero issues, barring a few pieces of terminology and a lot of NPC names being different, which I'll discuss in detail when I talk about the new English localization for the remake later down the line. I mentioned a new visual style that the remake goes for compared to the original, so let's talk about that. I don't think I can trust your opinions on JRPGs if you think the visuals for the original look bad or dated in any way. If you don't think you can play through an entire game with the art style of the original Sky, this might just not be the series for you. Even if you wait for all 3 Sky games to get remade, which I'm sure a lot of people are doing, the 4th and 5th games in the series, Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, use basically the exact same graphical engine as the Sky arc, so you're gonna have to deal with it for 2 full games eventually no matter what if you want to play the entire series. And besides, sprites are timeless. The original 5 look better than most indie RPGs that use sprites coming out these days, and they certainly age better visually than Falcom's first attempts at a fully 3D Trails game. That being said, this new reimagining of Liberl is gorgeous. I think this is the best looking game, and the highest production values overall I've ever seen out of Nihon Falcom. While the character designs remain identical beyond being translated into a different artist's art style, the color palette of the remake is noticeably different from that of the original, but not in a bad way. Instead of replicating the colors of the original game, it instead goes for the brighter, more vibrant color palette of a lot of 2D artwork from the original release. It captures the same vibe and feeling, but instead of being the original game but with all the character proportions scaled up, it is like that 2D art come to life. It might be different for someone who's only playing the game for the first time with the remake, but to me, playing it honestly feels less like I'm playing a ground-up remake of a top-down isometric game with 3D backgrounds and 2D sprites for characters, and more like I've slid into the alternate timeline where Trails in the Sky was always a fully 3D game, and this is just an extremely lovingly crafted remaster of that. Despite that feeling though, there's a lot in this game that could definitely not have been done on a console in 2004. The sprite animations in the original were always really impressive. Not just in battle animations that you'd see 100 times in a playthrough, but also in the bespoke choreography of when characters fight in cutscenes. The new animations in this art style are just as impressive in a completely different way. Some of them are very faithful recreations of the originals, and some of them are so much more over the top. Sometimes, like with katana users, is to align with how that fighting style is depicted in later games in the series, and other times it's just to make things look even cooler than they already did in sprite form. I'm pretty sure this is also Falcom's most liberal use of motion capture in a game, and all of the impressively choreographed scenes are translated pretty well and are just as awesome in the remake. Magic attack animations take the basis from the original game and just turn it up to 11. Basically, while it has the vibes of a PS2 game, there's a lot of stuff that you would not be seeing in one of those games outside of something pre-rendered, and it just shows up constantly in gameplay. There are also a lot of unique touches that just show attention to detail. A whole bunch of animations have 2 different variations, so you don't see the exact same animation every time you use the same move in battle. Sometimes you'll get a different version, sometimes you'll get the other version with a different voice line, and that helps a lot for variety. Plus, every version of each animation still looks cool. While the character portraits used in dialogue boxes in the original art style are irreplaceable, I think the remake's models, especially for the major characters, are nice and expressive too. Very intelligent choices were made when it came to crafting each expression, because in most cases they didn't try to force the new models into an exact replica of the original portraits, but instead made these new versions of the characters make different expressions that still convey the same emotion, though the few times where they do one-to-one replicate an original portrait are almost always used to great comedic or great gut-punching effect. On top of that, the remake boasts the largest and most interconnected areas in the entire Trails series. It's not a surprise that areas that were separated through several loading zones in the original game are combined into one loading zone in the remake, but each region of the kingdom, barring things like some dungeons at the inside of buildings, is all rendered at once. And due to having a fully controllable 3D camera, if you get up high, you can actually see a whole bunch of different areas from your vantage point. Plus, it makes fast travel almost instantaneous. It's very pretty to look at and works most of the time, but it kind of falls apart when it comes to the cities. The design of every single area from the 2004 game is very, very faithfully recreated here. And I'm not just talking about dungeon layouts, the location of treasure chests, and the way overworld areas connect with each other. I mean that the layout of every single town is exactly the same as it was in the original game. If you combine that with the fact that the town and all its surrounding highways are all on the same loading screen, it results in the major population centers in Liberl looking so small and having so few buildings that it completely breaks my suspension of disbelief. You could always assume that when you walk through multiple loading zones that made up a city in the original game, that you're actually walking through big portions of the city, and the areas you can actually explore are just relevant areas surrounding important landmarks, buildings, or where certain characters live. But nope, all the different loading screens are directly stitched together in this version, and the only buildings in each city are the buildings that were directly present in the original. Is it cool that you're able to look over the entire capital of Liberl, something that was split into like 6 different loading screens in the original? Absolutely. But later on in the series, we are told in no uncertain terms that this is a city with 300,000 people living in it, so while a first-time player wouldn't be thinking about anything like that at all, for someone revisiting the game with the remake, it just doesn't work and is completely incongruent with how big cities are depicted in other games that use this same 3D style. This is a city of a very similar size and history in Trails Through Daybreak. Unlike the cities in the Sky remake, it is split into 3 different loading zones, but these loading zones are just the highlights of 3 entirely different districts in the city that all have completely different vibes and serve different purposes. You only visit the relevant parts in the city, but you can clearly see tons of buildings in the background that have no connection to anything your characters would need to do while they're here, and there are a bunch of buildings on the streets that you can't enter at all because, well, those buildings are where the hundreds of thousands of people you don't see in gameplay are living. That's a bit of a downside, but a big upside is that the visual diversity of areas in the remake has been increased compared to the original. Lots of places that use the exact same textures in the original have been completely changed to differentiate themselves from each other, and all 5 cities now have much more distinct visual identities. Plus, a few more subtle changes have been added, such as making major highways a lot more well-maintained looking, which just fits a whole lot better with how the country is depicted, both in these games and how it's talked about in future ones. There are also a lot of little charming details, like small animals hanging around that have no gameplay purpose and just serve to be a cute thing you can find while you're exploring. Stars being faintly visible in the blue sky whenever a story sequence is close to dawn or twilight, and there frequently being literal trails in the sky if you look up, because Liberl is such a mountainous country that cars are almost non-existent, train tracks have never been built, and airships are actually the main form of public transport. While the areas you run through are gorgeous, the character models all look great, with even NPC models used in other Trails games being given a major coat of paint so that they're almost unrecognizable, and enemies that didn't appear in other 3D games are rendered very faithfully to their original sprites in 3D. Unfortunately, the level design itself sometimes leaves a lot to be desired. Dungeon design has never really been a strong suit in the Trails series, and this remake would have been a prime opportunity to experiment a bit and play around with the original layouts of the dungeons in the Sky games, especially because the combat system itself is completely different, so there's a lot of justification for changing the area design, but unfortunately the remake decided to be so faithful to the original that even dungeon layouts are identical. Dungeon navigation itself is vastly superior in the remake because you're actually able to look at a map while you're in dungeons this time, which does make figuring out confusing layouts more a case of looking at your map and solving a bit of a maze as opposed to trial and error like it used to be. But even the final dungeon, a boring, samey looking slog that's a massive misstep sandwiched between some of the best moments in the game, remains the same. And while maps and fast travel help a lot, I still would have preferred a dungeon that had maps and fast travel and also was more interestingly designed. While most of the quality of life changes in the remake compared to the original are very, very welcome, and bring one of the few actually outdated aspects of the original in line with more recent Trails games, sometimes I feel like they didn't go far enough. In recent titles, dungeon healing points, especially ones hidden behind points of no return, include more than just the option to heal, usually also letting you respawn the enemies to keep grinding, as well as containing weapon, item, and upgrade shops. Something not carried over here, as the healing points in the original Sky were only just that. Another example is in the cooking system. That's something present in every game, and there's always been instances of ingredients that only drop from enemies, but more recent titles have made it a lot easier to also be able to buy them from shops, something not carried over here to Sky, which is extra unfortunate because the amount of recipes you need to make to completely finish the recipe book in the remake is over double that of the original game, and especially in the final chapter, some ingredients can only drop from enemies that show up before a point of no return, and some of them only drop after, making it virtually impossible to actually complete the recipe book in only one playthrough unless you have a guide or know what to look for ahead of time, something that could have been completely averted by adding one new shop to the final town. I think there's also a bit of missed potential when it comes to overworld areas too, as maintaining their original layout means there's just a lot of long, spindly linear paths that only go from point A to point B, usually only being made a bit wider to accommodate larger and more enemy models being around. And while there are new items to pick up in addition to the treasure chests that were present in the original, usually even being things as massive as permanent stat boosters, it feels like kind of a waste to have this much stuff able to be loaded in at once and not take advantage of that to make larger areas that are more fun to explore. One really welcome addition that I never really needed to make much use of myself is the grinding caves. Each region of Liberl, and as such each chapter has one of them, which is a slightly hidden away little nook at the side of some major road or another, that just leads you into a tiny cavern where tons of enemies that appear throughout the chapter can spawn, that allows you very easy repeated grinding for experience, resources, and you could just exit and re-enter the cave to completely reset the enemies, so completely different ones might spawn, so if you need specific drops, you can grind those out pretty easily too. Another big improvement is when it comes to difficulty levels. The original game had only 3 difficulties: normal, hard, and nightmare. And well, let's just say normal was the only one of those difficulties that was actually remotely playtested. Keeping up with the standard of current Trails games though, the remake contains 5 difficulties: very easy, easy, normal, hard, and nightmare. And thankfully for experienced players, the harder difficulties are actually kind of difficult for the first time in quite a few games. I wouldn't say Nightmare is quite as difficult as the original Sky games on their hardest difficulties, especially the original second chapter on its hardest, but the difficulty design is a lot more deliberate and a lot more fair this time, so I think I ended up having a lot more fun, even if the overall difficulty rapidly fell off a cliff partway through the game after all of your combat options are unlocked, only really starting to return during the difficult endgame fights. While we're talking about difficulty settings, let's talk about the different versions of the game and the options available therein before we move on to the auditory side of presentation. Falcom used to be known for primarily making PC games, but in more recent years, they've only really developed the PlayStation versions of their games in-house, with external localizers and publishers being the ones responsible for porting to other platforms. In practice, that meant whatever the most recent PlayStation was at the time, and later on the Switch. Xbox is unfortunately not a platform any games in the series have come to, and we don't talk about Cold Steel 3 on the Stadia. In this case though, the game was first revealed in a Nintendo Direct, so the Switch port was a priority, developed by Falcom themselves, and possibly even was the base version of the game. Plus, this is their first in-house PC port in 15 years. Not only did they not miss a beat in terms of quality, but I was genuinely surprised with how good the PC port was. To be fully honest, it's not quite as good as the Western PC ports of the Trails Through Daybreak games, which are done by a company called PH3 and published by NIS America, but those are literally some of the best PC ports of PlayStation games I've ever seen, and Falcom was pretty clearly taking a lot of cues from those when developing this one. We're currently in an era where the standards to have an average PC port of a new JRPG release are just the game runs decently well. Having actual options like FOV, different HDR settings, and a double-digit number of graphics settings you can tweak is leaps and bounds above the competition. I only really have two nitpicks. Turbo mode is a staple of the series, and that's no different here. You even have options to change the turbo speed for both turn-based and action combat independently of each other, but in this game the controller input to activate it is hitting both bumpers simultaneously, something I don't think can be remapped at all, which is really awkward, especially because by default, the two bumpers, independently of each other, have two completely different functions, so it's very easy to miss input. This is especially bad because by default, the run toggle is left bumper, so frequently turning turbo on will result in you accidentally turning sprint off, which is pretty counterproductive if you're trying to move quickly. Additionally, the Steam version does not completely support the Switch Pro controller correctly. If you plug in a PlayStation controller, the control scheme should be identical to playing the PS5 version, but it counts Switch controllers as Xbox ones, so if you play with a Switch Pro controller, every button prompt in-game that says A actually means B, and vice versa, same thing for X and Y, and you have to remap all 4 face buttons in order to have the same control scheme as just playing the regular Switch release of the game, which is much more intuitive and a lot closer to how the Daybreak games play. The Switch port itself does run really well for the system it's on, although obviously in much lower resolution and frame rate than you can get on a PC or PS5, and there is a Switch 2 upgrade that costs all of $1. The Switch 2 version itself isn't great. It does not run as well as the Switch 2 version the game really should have, given how powerful the console is and how well it runs on more powerful PCs. But given other stories I've heard, I'm much more inclined to blame Nintendo for dragging their feet on giving Falcom a Switch 2 dev kit, forcing them to rush to have an upgrade patch out for release in the first place, rather than Falcom not putting in the necessary effort to make an actually good patch. Another thing you'll find in the settings is audio options, and one of the things in there is a choice between 3 different versions of the OST. The first is a brand new remixed version of the soundtrack made specifically for this remake. I think most of the tracks are pretty good, maybe not necessarily hitting the highs of a lot of the originals, but the worst thing I can say about most of them is it's a different take on the song, so it sounds off compared to the versions that I heard through the original Sky games, and then several years of listening to them outside the games before I ever heard the new versions. You also, of course, have the iconic, nostalgic original OST as an option, and then an arranged version from the Trails in the Sky Evo games. While this remake is in celebration of the series' 20th anniversary, for the series' 10th, the Sky games were remastered and re-released for PS Vita in Asian territories only. These versions got completely rearranged OSTs, as well as almost complete voice acting in Japanese. The quality of the Evo OSTs for the second and third games, or at least the tracks introduced in those games, is pretty contentious among the fanbase, but most of the first chapter Evo tracks are pretty highly regarded, so this is a third pretty good choice for the OST. Falcom games are known for their killer soundtracks, and while you can't mix and match between the 3 versions on a song-by-song basis, the fact that you have 3 versions, including the absolutely iconic original, means the remake absolutely follows that legacy. You also can choose between Japanese and an English dub for the voice acting, And while I do think both tracks are good in a vacuum, there are a few quirks with each of them. On the Japanese side, almost the entire cast has been recast compared to the originals, including many characters who show up elsewhere in the series, and even Estelle and Joshua themselves, so if you're planning on playing the entire series with Japanese voices, there's gonna be some discontinuity here, even if a lot of the recasts, and especially Estelle and Joshua, are very, very similar sounding to the other performances. While licensing issues prevented Falcom from just using the Evo voiceover again, I did mention that it was nearly comprehensive in the amount of dialogue it covered. That's not the case for the remake though, as it only has a little bit more voice acting than the average recent Trails game. Some choices as to which scenes were voiced and which weren't are kinda baffling to me. As well as the inclusion of one of my least favorite techniques that Falcom uses in all of the 3D Trails games. Completely voiced cutscenes are great, completely non-voiced cutscenes aren't ideal, but it's not like they didn't work perfectly fine for the original game. But for whatever reason, Falcom really loves to have scenes where either only a few lines are voiced and then the rest is non-voiced, although sometimes the same scene will become voiced later down the line, or, my least favorite thing, conversations where only one person is voice acted, and the person or people responding to them are not. This seems to have come from budgetary concerns, as the voice actors behind the protagonists of the Trails of Cold Steel and Trails Through Daybreak arcs are both very high profile and very expensive, but Estelle and Joshua's new VAs are a lot younger and have a lot less significant roles under their belt than their old ones, so I'm kinda confused with their thought process behind doing it here. As for the English dub, it did the exact opposite, choosing to retain the most recent voice actor for almost every single character who appears significantly in other Trails games, and recasting as little as possible. Overall, I think the performances everyone gives, as well as, for the most part, the voice direction, is pretty good, but there are a lot of issues with the new localization, and that leads to a lot of characters using the wrong word for things, or pronouncing them differently to how that same character would have said it in a different game, which results in several instances of very talented voice actors putting their all into a line with grammatical issues, word choice that's very out of character for that person, or sounding so dryly and literally translated from Japanese that no human being would ever actually say that. This means your two choices for voice acting are Japanese, with a vastly different cast from most of the rest of the series, and less comprehensive Japanese voice acting than this same script has gotten before, and it is pretty easy to mod the Evo voice acting into the official Western PC version of the original Sky games, or an English cast that is consistent with the rest of the series, but the words they're actually saying are not. These are probably complete non-issues for a more casual fan or someone starting the series with this game, but having context for the entire series means it is very noticeable and a bit of a sour spot when it comes to the remake. While a lot of cutscene dialogue isn't voiced, including some things that probably should be, there is still more voice acting than you would think, as a mechanic called the active voice system that's present in every other 3D Trails game has been added here as well, and that includes tons of brand new dialogue not present in the original game at all of which is voice acted. Active voice isn't a big deal, it's just characters having small conversations with each other in response to story events, side quests, or going to certain locations, but it is nice to have, very charming in almost every occasion, and provides a bit more bonding between your party members to explain why they're so close by the end of the game, as well as all being fully subtitled so you're not missing out on anything by playing with Japanese voices. Battle dialogue and incidental NPC lines when you pass by them are not subtitled, but that's a very, very small amount of the overall voice acting. None of the new active voice dialogue is earth-shattering or adds any new revelations or anything that wasn't present in the original game, and I'd be hard-pressed to even think of a new character trait for anyone that's first revealed there, but it is a good and noteworthy addition all the same. It gives you a whole lot more banter, as well as a whole lot more looks into characters' heads, and learning a bit more about their opinions on side quests, story events, and various locations. It's one of the biggest new sources of charm in the remake that's not present in the original game, and I do genuinely think it makes up for all the parts in the remake where charm that was present in the original isn't there, as well as parts where cutscenes aren't executed as well as they were in the original, or dialogue is especially not great. You would think the character getting roasted in these conversations the most would be Olivier, but no, it is actually Estelle. Part of that is of course because she's always in the party, but the other part is we get to hear her speak her thoughts out loud a lot more because of active voice, and she is very stream of consciousness, saying the first thing that comes to mind out loud, even if it's something outlandish, and Joshua always has a deadpan response for it, and it's almost always funny. It's been over 35 minutes of this review, let's finally talk about gameplay. Another staple of Trails that I'm honestly kind of surprised it's not more known for is the fact that behind Dragon Quest, it might actually be the longest running JRPG series that's still around, started turn-based, and still is to this very day. That doesn't mean, though, that this remake just directly translated the combat of the original Trails in the Sky, as it instead pulls from Falcom's 20 years refining the battle system, and almost acts more as a greatest hits compilation of ideas they've tried out along the way. The basis of the battle system is drawn from Trails Through Daybreak, as that was the most recent big new iteration of it, though the character movesets and list of magic you have access to is almost directly pulled from the original Trails in the Sky, and replacing some Daybreak mechanics that are lore-based to those games and wouldn't make sense to show up here, are a few things from the Trails of Cold Steel games to add a bit more complexity. I wouldn't necessarily call the battle system overly complicated or hard to get into, and I do think it is pretty well tutorialized in the remake, honestly even better than it was in the original, but it is definitely more complicated than the original Sky, so if you start here and then go to the original second chapter, or play remakes of all three Sky games and go to Trails from Zero, you might notice that the upward trend of complexity that the original Sky arc into Zero had is gone, and you don't get the same sense of seeing how Falcom built on their ideas arc by arc that you would if you just played the original Sky games. That being said, the Daybreak games have one of the best turn-based battle systems of all time, and this certainly follows suit in that regard, so it's not really a complaint, just an observation that you might kind of be spoiling yourself a little bit if you start here, and the battle system won't quite hit the heights of this game for a few more entries if you continue on chronologically. Now, I said that battles are turn-based, and that is 100% true and where almost all the complexity lies, but outside of Trails, Falcom is most renowned for killer action RPGs, and they brought that into the Daybreak games as well as this remake. Encounters with regular enemies in overworld and dungeon areas can also be engaged in an action combat mode. Your options are very limited compared to something like the East series. All you have is a multi-hit combo on one button, a dodge button, a meter for a more powerful attack that can be filled up either by doing damage or instantly by doing a perfect dodge, and canceling a dodge into either a regular or stronger attack will result in a different animation. This isn't designed for you to play through the entire game this way, it's instead there to streamline and speed up the process of fighting through regular enemies, ones that you wouldn't have any trouble with whatsoever in a turn-based format either, as well as allowing you to soften up more powerful ones, giving you an advantage when you can seamlessly press a button to transition into the regular turn-based combat. There's no strict turn order in this battle system. It functions more like Final Fantasy X or the Xenosaga games, where you can see the order characters will be moving next on one side of the screen, and the amount of turns someone gets is dependent on their speed stat, with you being able to do things to manipulate the turn order, make your characters move faster, or delay enemies' actions. You have 3 different meters to manage: HP, EP, and CP. HP is exactly what you'd expect it to be, and EP is your magic points. Magic spells, called arts in this series, have casting times, so on your character's turn, you input them to cast the spell and choose its targets, then you have to wait a certain amount of time before that character will actually cast the art, so there's a good chance other combatants will move in between them, and both you and enemies have abilities to interrupt other people's casts. This adds a lot of complexity in planning, as on a character's turn you can freely move around in a radius around them depending on their move stat, and if you know enemies will be moving in between when you input an art and when the cast comes out, you have to strategically place the AoE to try and make sure they don't move out of range when you do that, or if you're charging up a heal, you have to make sure the character who's at low HP doesn't walk out to land a melee ranged attack. Another quality of life thing from later on in the series that's sorely missed here is the art menu being split into offensive and supporting arts, as it's just one long list, and the Sky games make it a lot easier to have dozens of arts on the same character compared to later ones, so it's even worse than if those games didn't have a split list. The most unique thing about Trails combat is the way you have characters learn different arts, as they're not inherent to the character or learned via level up. Almost every character in the game can gain access to almost every art, because it depends on certain equipment. For the most part, gearing characters is very simple. You have a weapon, armor, shoes, and 2 accessory slots, and while later games do add a lot more, accessories are very simple in this one, usually being simple stat boosts or immunities to one or more status conditions. One very welcome change from the original is that weapons also give you an arts boost in addition to a raw strength boost, so your casters also benefit heavily from upgrading weapons, and it makes the sense of progression feel more real. The real meat of customization, though, comes in orbment layouts. The advent of orbital technology has completely changed life in Zemuria at a rapid pace, and that goes for warfare too. Bracers, soldiers, and civilians who need to defend themselves alike all have devices known as tactical orbments, pocket watch-shaped gadgets each attuned to a specific person that boost their physical abilities and allow access to magic known as orbital arts. Combat orbments are modular devices and can be modified by slotting in quartz into one of the 6 slots on each orbment. Quartz work a lot like materia in that they either provide stat bonuses or some other kind of perk, but each one belongs to one of 7 elements, as well as providing points to an elemental stat. Every character's orbment slots have a different layout split into 1 or more lines, and the amount of each elemental point on a given line in the orbment determines what arts that character is able to use. All your characters start with 1 or more slots locked, and you're able to unlock them as you progress through the game using items that drop from enemies, so that's where your progression comes from. Not only do you get better quartz as you go, you can also craft those using the same enemy drops, but you're also able to give each character more quartz, up to 6, and that allows them even more options, as well as buffing them in more different ways. Characters are balanced between physical and magic, not just based on their stats, but also based on their orbment layouts. Physical characters have more lines with more elemental restrictions on certain slots, making it a lot harder to get arts of a higher cost or some elements, and some high cost ones being almost completely inaccessible altogether, while characters who are designed to be more magic-based have less lines and less elemental restrictions, with Estelle being a classic all-rounder protagonist, having 2 lines with no elemental restrictions whatsoever, and new to this remake, her stats are actually pretty good compared to other characters, so you can build her whichever way you choose and get a lot more use out of her. Honestly, Estelle being buffed relative to her original incarnation is one of the biggest things the remake's combat has over the original. You have both Estelle and Joshua in your party for almost the entire game, and there are big sections where they're your only party members, but in the original, not only was it very unbalanced to the point where arts were basically the only way to do a whole lot of damage, but Joshua was also just objectively a much better character than Estelle, so the optimal way to play as your main character was just to load her up with healing and buffing spells and let Joshua do all the work. Now, while Joshua is probably still better, Estelle can hold her own a whole lot better, which massively increases the amount of viable party builds you can go for. Physical damage and physical-based characters have also been massively buffed, so it as a whole is way more viable. And speaking of physical attacks, I do believe there's another meter we haven't discussed yet. That is the green CP meter, which stands for craft points. While arts are customizable based on quartz layout, crafts are your character's specific abilities. You gain CP as you deal and take damage up to a maximum of 200, and can then spend it on crafts, which unlike arts come out instantly, with more being learned as characters level up. A lot are stronger or more elaborate physical attacks than just landing with a regular attack, but there's also some healing, some self, some party buffs, some enemy debuffs, and at least one attack craft per character has been changed to do magic damage in this version, which was not a thing at all in the original. Learn levels and order have been shuffled around a bit, but basically every single craft was one that same character had in the OG, and their effects are largely similar, just changed to fit the new battle system. So if you do start with this game and then choose to go on to the original version of Second Chapter, you'll already kinda know how characters play. It's also very friendly to people who have already played the original, because the very similar craft loadouts and identical orbment loadouts and overall arts list means that strategies you used in the original game still work perfectly fine in the remake, you just have the added advantage of even more being viable than there used to be. Characters' ultimate abilities are known as S-crafts, and using them empties their entire CP meter. They can be activated as long as you have more than 100, and get buffed as you go all the way to the max of 200. They're also unique in that, as long as a character has at least 100 CP, you can activate the S-craft at any point in time, and they'll hijack the turn order to use it immediately after the current turn, something known as an S-break. This can be useful for many things, like finishing off an enemy, squeezing a little bit of usefulness out of a character you know is going to get targeted and killed soon, or even just using it so you can move around with the character and get out of an upcoming AoE. This is all bread and butter stuff that started in the original Trails in the Sky and has been a constant in the series up to this day, but I do have one complaint with how this specifically is handled compared to the original. A unique thing Trails brings to this kind of turn order is that certain turns have bonuses applied to them, which you can see down on the list as turns come up. These can range from guaranteed crits, being able to cast an art instantly, regaining some HP, and getting more drops out of enemies if you hit on that turn. But in the original game, you could use S-crafts to steal the bonus of the next upcoming turn. So if an enemy is about to crit, you can S-break and not only deny them that crit against you, but also use that crit against them. Stealing turn bonuses does still exist in the remake, it's just a lot less elegant and intuitive. Instead of how it used to work, all damaging S-crafts and some regular crafts have steal turn bonus as an additional effect. So if an enemy has a crit turn and you hit them with your S-break, you'll instead get the crit turn for yourself on that character's next turn, instead of it immediately being applied to that S-craft. The other way to steal turn bonuses is by stunning an enemy, as every enemy has a stun meter, and all of your attacks have a certain stun value that increases that. When the stun meter is maxed out, the enemy will be stunned, be unable to act for their next turn, and all damage dealt to them is massively increased. While you also build them up slowly just by dealing damage, hitting an enemy with a crit, stunning it, or hitting an enemy that's already been stunned gives you a bravery point up to a maximum of 5. Landing a hit in one of those 3 scenarios, or simply starting a turn-based battle with advantage by stunning an enemy in action combat before pressing the button to transition into turn-based, gives you 3 different options. For free, you can have a nearby ally do a follow-up regular attack. For 3 points, you and one ally can team up to do a combo attack on the enemy and any near it, and at certain points in the story, eventually permanently unlocked, for all 5 points, you can have all of your party members do a big combo attack that hits every enemy in the battle, as well as dealing a bunch of stun damage to anyone that's not already stunned. To add to this, each character also gets a progression track that unlocks more passive abilities for them as you go, ranging from healing a party member who just got hit, defending someone who's already at low health, taking much reduced damage yourself, finishing an enemy off if someone else's attack leaves them low, and even a proc-based chance for each character to buff themselves after their turn, restoring CP and giving a stat increase for a few turns. Needless to say, you are given a lot of options in this game, and it's almost impossible to be put in a situation where there's not at least some tool you haven't been using enough that would be able to get you out of it. Fair warning though, as fun as it is to play, I still can't really recommend actually going through with platinuming it. If you want to get more out of the game, I'd recommend doing some sort of challenge run instead. There's an achievement for finishing the game on the maximum difficulty, as well as one for beating the final boss on New Game Plus, with an optional setting that increases enemy levels during the second go-around enabled. Those are fairly reasonable, but some of the other tasks require so much mindless repetition of various game actions that even though I went into my first playthrough knowing I'd also have to do New Game Plus, and spreading the grinding out across the entirety of both playthroughs, I still had to stop and grind for several hours in the final dungeon of New Game Plus, just to get everything else besides beating the stronger final boss. The game's level scaling is an absolute strong point, and you're pretty closely rubber banded to being at most 1 or 2 levels above the next major boss, but that also kind of fell apart at the end of New Game Plus, as even with all that grinding, which reduced every enemy in the final dungeon to giving me single or double-digit numbers of experience when I needed thousands for each level, I was still well below the upgraded final boss, and that seemed to have made it virtually impossible using my current strategies, so to get that final achievement I did just end up reducing the difficulty by a couple pegs, because if I wanted to completely re-outfit my party to properly take on that challenge, I would have needed to go through the game several more times in New Game Plus Plus anyway. I think it's pretty safe to say, though, that I'm a massive fan of the game and can recommend it to almost anyone interested in it, and every criticism I've had so far is fairly minor in the grand scheme of things, or something I have equal issue with in the original, which, while yes, it is still a flaw that the remake didn't fix problems the original game has, I'm much more willing to forgive that kind of problem than something completely new to the remake being poorly executed. In a similar vein to that, though, you might notice there is one very major and very controversial aspect of the game I've yet to discuss, and that is definitely where the vast majority of my significant criticisms lie: the localization and Western publishing of the game. There has always been some scuff when it came to Western releases of the Trails series. Localizations of any of them at all only started after it had been around for several years and was several entries deep, and due to the massive amounts of text, Trails games are also a lot harder to localize even than the average JRPG. Despite this though, the original Sky localizations done by Xseed are very well beloved in the community, And despite being instructed by Falcom to skip over games 4 and 5 to immediately jump to the much more popular and profitable Cold Steel games, leaving a big gap in the middle of the series for Western fans for years to come, their work on the 5 games they localized is still the high watermark for the series as a whole, and honestly a pretty big gold standard that not a lot of other franchises out there, even much more popular ones, have ever been able to reach. Fans were of course very concerned when NIS America instead took up the Western localization and publishing rights, starting with the 3rd Cold Steel game, and those fears were not unfounded, as the first few Falcom games they published fell far short of the standards of quality and quality assurance that the original Xseed games had. Over the years though, NISA's products have significantly improved, largely owing to smart choices like hiring as many people who worked on localizations of Trails for Xseed as possible, and even recruiting fan translators who mimicked Xseed's style to make fan translations of the 2 games they'd skipped. Now that they've gotten to the Daybreak arc, the actual quality of localization they've been putting out, barring a couple really glaring things that had their name changed in a way that makes them sound infinitely worse, is almost on par with the best Xseed had to offer back in the day. And they've finally been able to start closing the gap between Japanese and worldwide releases, to the point where the series is never going to be more than 1 game behind again. NISA has gone from people being concerned that them being given the license would kill the Trails series just as badly as if no one picked it up after Xseed lost it, to the only real issues with them being actions of the company as a whole, and every Trails launch by them still being slightly botched in some way, be it issues with shipping of physical editions, or significantly debilitating bugs in the launch and release of games requiring an early patch. In spite of these improvements, when a remake of the first Sky game was announced, fans were hopeful that Xseed would be handling the localization and publishing again, as they have done so for re-releases of other Falcom games they published the initial versions of, and that would also keep NISA's plate freer and ensure that their localization of Trails Beyond the Horizon would come faster and at a higher quality. Needless to say, history ended up repeating itself, and there was a whole lot of worry going around when it was announced that not only would GungHo, a company that's never worked with Falcom in the past, be handling Western publishing for the game, but it would also feature a brand new English localization, despite the Japanese script remaining identical, and be the first simultaneous worldwide release in series history. Unfortunately, history did repeat itself completely, as the remake has a lot of localization issues, to the point where I think it is an even worse job than NISA's first attempt at Trails in Cold Steel 3, being made even more egregious that a nearly complete localized script already existed, and as far as we know, the license to that remained with Falcom, not Xseed, so it was a deliberate choice not to use that for some unknown reason. Before discussing any problems with the English localization and Western publishing as a whole, I have to acknowledge the massive step forward that is this being the first Trails game to have official localizations in Spanish, German, and French, which regardless of everything else I'm going to say, is a massive step forward for accessibility for the franchise, and given how this is a game that's specifically there to be an enticing starting point for new players, is something GungHo absolutely needs to be commended for. I can't speak to the quality of any of those 3 localizations personally, but judging by the credits, about twice as many people worked on each of those languages as did the English version, and both localization and editing were handled by Side, a company that has done a lot of good work with a lot of other publishers on a lot of iconic games, both recently and historically. As for English, localization is credited to Actil Incorporated, a company that's probably most well known for handling the localizations of the Atelier series before that was taken in-house by Gust. 4 people are credited there, and there's a separate section for additional editing, which is credited to Side Europe, with 3 names listed for that. Well, as far as I know, Actil's Atelier localizations are highly regarded. 7 people is just far too few to be working on the script for a Trails game when you have a deadline for a worldwide release. For comparison, while Trails Through Daybreak does have a larger script, a conservative estimate for the amount of people who directly worked on the English localization for it is 20, and that was back when NISA still had a backlog of several games to get through to be caught up. On top of that, Actil is a Los Angeles-based company, while Side Europe is based out of London, so that means 2 companies, 8 hours apart on 2 completely different continents, both had a hand in this new script. That part's probably not as bad as it sounds on paper though, because the English voice recording was recorded and produced by the LA-based Side US branch, but the script definitely feels rushed and disjointed in a lot of places. It genuinely feels like different people with different translation philosophies worked on different parts of the script, and there was not a lot of editing tying things together. The quality of the script overall ranges from about the same quality as the original Xseed script, just a different take on the same line, to a completely good JRPG script that just doesn't stylistically match how Trails is usually written, and contains some inaccuracies with terminology, to a lot of lines, some of which are even voiced, that feel exactly like unedited machine translation. Lines that have Japanese sentence structure instead of being reworded to flow well in English, frequently using repetitive and dry word choices instead of something an actual English-speaking human being would say, are bad enough. But I think the worst part is that it seems like it isn't just obvious that this script was done by people who've never worked on the Trails series before, but I also get the impression that no one who worked on this script actually went back and looked at any of the dozen pre-existing Trails localizations, even as far as seeing how some important terms to the series are translated or pronounced in English. The remake was advertised as having a new English script that would be closer to the Japanese than the original Xseed one. The Xseed script is absolutely punched up compared to a direct translation of the original Trails in the Sky, and I do think some of their embellishments go too far and haven't aged particularly well, but overall does manage to capture the tone, emotions, and meaning of every line very well, while having a strong voice and injecting a lot of personality into it, and having very few typographical errors and almost no outright mistranslated lines. Needing to revamp the script to accommodate voice acting is one thing I've heard a lot of people suggest as a reason for doing the new localization in the first place, but barring a few scenes where the length of lines does need to be very similar to Japanese for timing reasons, there's absolutely nothing wrong with voice acting the original script. There are tons of Let's Plays on this very site where someone reads out all the dialogue that prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the original script does sound just as good and natural in voice form. Xseed made a lot of smart decisions to change things that sound completely fine in Japanese, but are pretty awkward when put directly into English. You won't find many instances of someone repeating what someone just said to them back as a question in the original script, and Estelle's Japanese catchphrase, which literally translates simply to "what?" is rendered as something different, though equally as incredulous, almost every time it shows up. Quality aside, Xseed's work on the original Sky games also set the localization precedent for the entire Trails series going forward, establishing the English terminology for almost every proper noun in the series, which has remained consistent, even usually including the dub pronunciations of everything, through the publisher shifts to the present day. This consistency is not present here though, as a whole bunch of people, places, and things are pronounced differently in the dub, or outright called something completely different in this version, which is kind of a problem when it's being pitched as a new starting point. Even the inconsistencies themselves are inconsistent. As an example, the Liberal Army's Royal Guard is usually called that in this version, consistent with every other Trails localization, but I noticed a couple of times where it was referred to as the King's Guard instead, which makes very little sense, both because its Japanese name includes the kanji for royal family and not just king, so this new name isn't exactly more accurate to the Japanese, which I thought was the entire point of the new localization, and a very important part of the story is that Liberal has had a ruling queen for 40 years, so there's no way it would be called that in the first place. There are a lot of weird small choices like this, including names that are more consistently changed to not match the originals, that feel like this localization was done without just ignoring precedent from the rest of the series, but without background story and world knowledge of the game itself. As an example, there's a piece of voice dialogue where someone refers to Cassius Bright as bearded, even though the only facial hair he's ever had is a mustache. This happened because the term used in Japanese is a blanket expression that just means facial hair in general, but that means that this line made it through initial translation, editing, and everyone required to get it said out loud by a voice actor in the booth without anyone going and checking what character was being referred to by this ambiguous Japanese term, and seeing that it's someone who didn't have a beard at all. That was the first example that came to mind, but there are plenty of other lines that sound perfectly fine on their own, but make little sense in context. One of the in-universe books you can read is a guide to understand cat language, and the entire point of that book being there is that you can use it to understand what every single cat in the Trails in the Sky trilogy is saying, but nothing was done to ensure that the new translation of the book, and new translation of things cats actually say, were consistent with each other, so a prominent cat NPC, who you're supposed to be able to understand almost the entire time, is completely unintelligible now. That's not to say this new localization doesn't change a few things that were really weird and arbitrary about the Xseed version, as a bunch of random NPCs throughout the game who were given English-sounding names for some reason in the original script have had their names changed to be in line with their Japanese ones. Another character's name had an R swapped for an L, now making her fit in with a naming theme from other characters connected to her, And the dog enemies that were originally called Dobermans in the Xseed script have had their names changed to Dovin, matching the Japanese, and most later games in the series they show up in, as they're supposed to be a reference to the Dovin Wolf from Mobile Suit Gundam Double Zeta, and not any specific real-world dog breed. I'd call stuff like that a net positive, but there are also a lot of other things that show that accuracy to Japanese isn't exactly a priority of this new localization. As another example, an NPC side plot that you can follow throughout the entire game is one of two NPCs becoming a couple and progressing their relationship. In Japanese, these characters are a woman named Eari and a man named Arumu. The Xseed script chose to tweak their names, calling the woman Ellie and the man Armand. This is consistent in every Sky game, as well as games outside the Sky arc and not published by Xseed that also include those characters. In the version of the remake script present in the demo, the woman is called Aria, and the man Arium. They were changed to Ellie and Armand in the final game, so there is no inconsistency with the rest of the series now, but the new localized names were pretty clearly less accurate to the Japanese than the original Xseed ones were, and yet they were still changed. As far as I can tell, in the final game at least, every single character who makes an appearance outside the Sky arc does have a name consistent with the rest of the series, though I can't be certain if that's true for characters who are only mentioned by name elsewhere. A lot of pieces of equipment, consumable items, and quartz names were established in the original Sky games and became consistently used elsewhere in the series, and while some of them are consistent with the pre-established names here, some others are different, and it seems to be on a very arbitrary basis. Septium Vein makes it through unscathed, but Scent has been changed to Sweet Aroma, and while Gladiator Belt is unchanged, Gladiator Headband has become Victory Headband, even though their Japanese names are identical besides the part saying headband or belt. These are mostly small ones, but there are a few others that are pretty egregious. One that you wouldn't think is too big a deal is that acerbic tomatoes are called bitter tomatoes in this localization, which, yeah, okay, that's just one item that originated in this game and shows up elsewhere that's called something different, but they do have a running gag background subplot that's lasted the entire series so far, so I think it's worth pointing out, especially because other things that started long-running joke subplots, like the characters Anton and Ricky, do keep their names from the rest of the series, even though Ricky's Japanese name is actually Rix. There are a bunch of other small things like this, like how the term Jaeger is used a lot differently in sentences in this localization compared to the rest of the series, and it being capitalized when it usually isn't, as well as the term Heavy Blade being frequently misattributed to Agate's sword rather than as a title for the man himself, but definitely the worst in this regard is the complete absence of the term Archaism in this entire game. That's something that doesn't show up a lot in Sky First Chapter, but immediately starting with the second Sky game, it becomes a very important and relevant term for the entire rest of the series, and has been mostly replaced with the term Orbal Golem in this version. I guess that's technically more accurate, as the Japanese name directly translates to something along the lines of puppet weapon, and it does have a quote-unquote official English pronunciation of Orbal Muppet of all things, and I completely understand why no one wanted to keep that in English. But Orbal Golem specifically is a really bad choice, because actual golems do appear later on in the series, and are called that both in Japanese and English. So this has a knock-on effect of different games in the series calling the same thing two different names, while also implying a relationship between two completely unconnected things that's not supposed to exist. This kind of thing is all over the pronunciation of names and terminology in the dub as well, and I really don't get how any of this happened, given how there are 7 games that are dubbed already with cutscenes readily available online, as well as very good resources like the Kiseki Wiki and trailsinthedatabase.com that would allow anyone, casual fan or brand new localizer to the series alike, to look up the names used for specific Japanese terms elsewhere in the series and exactly how they've already been pronounced in English. The most obvious one is a pronunciation that I have used several times throughout this video already. The name of the kingdom the game takes place in. Every other dub in the series has consistently called it Liberal, but this one instead says Liberal, or literally just Liberal. This includes a lot of actors who are returning from other games in the series where it was consistently pronounced Liberal, and I noticed a couple of times where Estelle specifically did still call it Liberal in this version, meaning her actress did remember how it's supposed to be said in English, but was actively directed to pronounce it differently. On top of that, pronouncing it liberal or liberal is less accurate to its Japanese name. The romanized spelling we see in this game has been consistently used by Falcom for almost 20 years now, and it's spelled Riberu in katakana. You might notice that the English spelling is liberal but without the A, and the Japanese pronunciation is actually Riberaru without the ra, and with the be extended to fill the space. The entire point of the name in both languages is to be the English word liberal, but without the a, and yet both pronunciations used in this dub include one. As one last example, I will use this character and things associated with him. You've probably seen him already in trailers or earlier in this video. He's a party member who's mostly a mentor without too big of a plot role in the Sky games, but he's recently come to a bit more prominence in the Trails Through Daybreak titles, as those take place in his home country. People going directly to this game from the Daybreak games will see a lot familiar in him. In Daybreak 1, his English voice actor was recast from Patrick Seitz to Vic Chow, who also plays him in the Sky remake, and with the exception of a couple characters being given new crafts entirely, so everyone has at least 3, his moveset was the most changed in between the original Sky and this remake, all in an effort to make him play closer to his more fleshed out depiction in the Daybreak arc. That's all well and good, but if you were to play a Daybreak game, he will be introduced to you as Jin Vatek, also known as Jin the Immovable, a bracer from the Calvard Republic. But here, he's introduced to you as Zin Vathek, also known as the Immovable Zin, a bracer from the Calvard Republic. Almost every single important proper noun about this guy has had his pronunciation arbitrarily changed, even when compared to Trails Through Daybreak 2, which released only 8 months earlier than this game. Okay, sure, Calvard is closer to how the name of the Republic is pronounced in Japanese, even though English dubs have used a different pronunciation for a decade now, and the Immovable Zin is the exact same word order as his title is in Japanese, even though the previous version, putting immovable after his name, sounds much better, but at least they pronounced his name less accurately. Jin Vatek is more or less exactly his Japanese name, while the way it's said in this game is further away. Honestly, I mostly just feel bad for Jin as a character, because this kind of keeps happening to him. The original version of the Xseed script actually called him Zane, and it was later changed to Jin in a patch, so the PSP version of Sky First Chapter still calls him that. But yeah, he cannot catch a break. I find it hard to believe more accuracy was even a goal of this localization in the first place, because every report I've seen from someone who's actually proficient in Japanese and has compared Xseed to this script to the Japanese one, has said that this new one is actually not any more accurate in any meaningful way. It just differs from Xseed's take in different places, which, given how its writing is almost universally worse, completely destroys any purpose it might have had for existing. I cannot understand why they didn't just use the Xseed script, only doing new work to fix things that are mistranslations or cover text that's new or changed in this version, especially because the initial English screenshots GungHo provided did use the Xseed script verbatim, so there might have even been a build of the game that actually had it in. I also noted a lot of grammatical errors in several instances where voice dialogue did not match the text on screen, and menus have a lot of issues as well, from inaccurate skill descriptions to Jin's overview slide calling one of his crafts by the wrong name. It's frustrating because if they used the Xseed script for everything that's identical in the Japanese version, none of these issues would exist, period, because it's already extremely polished, and it would have given the remake staff a lot more time and a much narrower focus to ensure that all the new text that did need to be localized is up to the same standard. The funny thing about all of this, though, is that the only people who are really clamoring for a new localization for Trails in the Sky are the kind of people who don't know what they're talking about, but are always demanding the most accurate and direct translation for the Japanese possible. Also, localizers are the devil. They're not going to like this version of the script either. There are plenty of colloquialisms and slang in here, and even terms like eepy, salty, and sus show up. I have absolutely no problem with slang like that being in my Trails localizations, and in fact, the use of Riz in Daybreak 2 not only makes complete sense in context and from the character who says it, but even replaces a piece of internet slang from Japanese. In this case though, I'm kinda iffy on it. It's applied to characters who probably wouldn't say stuff like that, and I think 2020's internet slang doesn't work for a nostalgic remake of the first game in the series when the overall technology level of the world is much lower, and things like the in-universe internet don't exist yet. 2004 slang, matching when the game first came out in Japan, or even 2011 slang, matching when it first came out in English, I think would have fit a lot better. Olivier saying "can't a girl catch a break" though is absolutely perfect, no notes. I think I would be actively angry instead of disappointed about this localization if they didn't nail most of his dialogue as well as they did. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I don't know if there's something preventing GungHo from just using the Xseed script, which is the thing they should be doing if that's at all possible, only making tweaks as needed. But if not, For future Trails localizations, there absolutely needs to be someone on the editing staff for the regular localization and someone involved in the dub recording process who is experienced with the Trails series. Preferably someone who's actually worked on localizations for those before. And I don't know, maybe NISA contractors are more easily reachable now that they're almost completely caught up and they just weren't last time. But at the very least, someone who is intimately familiar with the series and knows how things are supposed to be called and pronounced should be involved every step of the way to stop any of these issues from making it into the game, period. I'm not saying this to directly criticize the work of anyone who did something on the localization of this game, which is why I haven't mentioned any names beyond company ones at all, and I do have hope that these issues will be rectified in the next game, and possibly also in this one. As I already mentioned, Armand and Ellie's names were fixed in between the demo and the final game, and while I was in the middle of recording the voiceover for this video, the game was patched. I couldn't tell exactly what was changed, I think it was mostly unlocking DLC, but I was immediately able to notice they already went in and fixed a typo in one of the menus, where the word unused was misspelled as unsued. Some issues were even fixed after fan outcry before anyone was even able to play the game, as Charizard's title was first said as Silver Flash on the website, but that was later corrected to Silver Streak, matching the original Sky and the rest of the series, and is consistent in the game itself, including numerous times where it's said out loud. It is clear that the developers are aware there are a lot of issues here, and seem committed to fixing at least some of them, so as of now, the problems don't diminish my endorsement of the game, especially from someone starting here, because the issues are going to be much less apparent if this is your first touchstone. So I do absolutely still encourage politely discussing issues online, and I don't know if it would help, but if you have any specifics, maybe also very politely, email them to GungHo and see if they can get passed on to someone who can make a difference. Obviously, a lot of stuff is in voice dialogue, and that's not going to be changed instantly. The next time any of the voice actors will even be in the booth is when they're recording their characters' lines for the next game, so that kind of stuff would be the last thing to be changed if it ever is, but a lot of other issues are genuinely only text-based, and some of them are genuinely as simple as taking every instance of an incorrect term and replacing it with a correct one. Obviously, in terms of implementing that into a new build of the game and getting a patch published, that's way more work than just Control-F, Control-V, but when compared to relocalizing the entire game like they already did, even just a few small things done by the localization staff would do a lot to significantly improve the entire product, and the less work that needs to go into fixing the first chapter localization means more time that can be spent making sure no problems exist at all in the second chapter one. While I have plenty of problems with it, this entire game release has been a very interesting window into how localization is even handled, though this seems to be an exception given how rushed it was. And that's because, between the initial Switch release of the demo, every other version of the demo, the 1.0 version of the game that was on physical copies, and the current patch, there have been 4 different localization builds of the prologue that were publicly released. Some of them are straight up less complete than others and having untranslated text, but despite that, some of the older builds are actually more consistent to the Xseed version in terms of terminology, as well as writing style in some cases, with the build in, I believe, the 1.0 version of the final game giving Estelle a line much closer to the classic "Why is my present a boy?" than what she says in the current patch. This is kind of upsetting, because that means that maybe in previous builds, the new localization did stick a lot closer to the original well-renowned one, and at some point a choice was made to actively distance from it, resulting in a much worse product, and seemingly a very rushed second pass that added a whole bunch more issues. But at the same time, if that is the case, then that means the current team is capable of doing something closer to what XC did. And if more of the game was done in that same style in the original build, then maybe there already even is a basis for improving some of the dialogue in later patches down the line. The build the Switch demo released in even had several completely different line reads to match the earlier versions of the dialogue, so there's already precedent for re-recording voice acting when a line gets rewritten. The localization is easily the weakest part of the remake as it stands right now, but at the same time, unless the second chapter remake launches in just as bad a state, and this one is never patched to make the improvements it needs, I don't see any reason to respond to those issues with anything more than calmly pointing out why things are bad and how they can be improved, because, well, this is ultimately all fixable. As for things that aren't as fixable, you might find it weird that 4 builds of the localization were publicly released within a month. And yeah, unfortunately, the game's release has been an absolute mess from the publishing side of things. The Switch demo launched days later than the PlayStation and Steam ones, and launched with the wrong localization patch that was so far behind, Spanish, French, and German weren't even present until the update brought it to parity with the other ones. There's no GOG release for the game, which has been a staple for the Trails series, and there are a lot of fans who prefer to get their PC versions through there over Steam. Regional pricing has been really screwed up, so while some people are getting it cheaper than they've ever been able to buy a new Trails game before, other regions who can usually count on a discount are instead paying more than North America. DLC was completely broken on launch, and instead of providing refunds to the people who were affected by it, GungHo instead apologized by discounting the prices of things, meaning people who weren't affected by the problem now get the DLC cheaper, while people who were affected still had to wait and get nothing in return. And the special edition manufacturing and distribution was done through Limited Run Games, who are being as limited run about it as you'd think, to the point where a week after the game released, they sent out an email apologizing for the delay and saying they just started production on the Steelbook, which they'd earlier promised would be shipped out on the game's actual release date. This is not a great look for the first launch in the series from a new publisher, especially when that game is the one that has the most potential newcomers to Trails eyeing it, a record that will likely never be broken again unless the series completely blows up enough to escape its niche status. And I'm not really sure what to say. It's extremely frustrating as a long-term fan of the series who's seen so many Western releases be bungled in some way or another, and knowing that this is the best chance for the series to become as popular as it deserves, and who knows how many people will be turned off from buying the remake because of some or all of these problems. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to be affecting things much yet. Actual reputable journalistic outlets, unlike me, are reviewing the game extremely well. This is still the most I've seen new players start the series at once. Trust me, I know, my now outdated How to Start Trails guide is one of the most viewed ones of those out there, and it's been getting more activity recently despite being so outdated than when the video itself was directly referenced on the Trash Taste podcast. Plus, in addition to patching some localization errors already, GungHo has already sent out an email indicating that there is a planned patch to improve issues with the Switch 2 version. So as long as they keep listening, responding to criticism, and making things right, I do think it's going to be okay in the long run. And well, the game is still very good. Is Trails in the Sky First Chapter Remake the best game in the Trails series? No. Is the original Trails in the Sky First Chapter the best game in the Trails series? Also no. Are both of the games still must-play JRPGs because the average quality of the series is so good? Yes, absolutely. This is a rare example in the games industry of a remake not trying to replace the original game, and honestly, not even trying to be the definitive version of it. It's a celebration of the original Trails in the Sky, while also providing an alternate, more modernized take on it. Does that also mean this is a new entry point for the series? Oh, absolutely. I'm gonna throw an asterisk on that, but that is a very time-limited asterisk. And that's because I'm gonna say this isn't as good a starting point as the original Sky, but only for now. And that's just because finishing Sky First Chapter is going to make you immediately want to play Sky Second Chapter. And since a remake of that doesn't exist yet, and the original Second Chapter has the same accessibility issues the original First Chapter did, while also having the major localization differences and completely different gameplay formula from the First Chapter remake, I do technically have to say that the original First Chapter is a better starting point right now, but by, let's just say, the time the Second Chapter remake gets its release date confirmed, the two really will be even with each other, assuming the remake's localization gets improved by then. And that's kind of awesome, actually. If you want to start Trails, Trails in the Sky is the best place to do it. And you get to pick and choose whichever version of that appeals to you most, because both games are just about equal in quality, and there are positives and negatives for choosing each one as a starting point. Honestly, I think having two versions of the first game makes the series more accessible to potential newcomers than pulling Cold Steel 1 out from the middle of the series saying, alright, yeah, you could start here and then play the second game, but then you'll have to loop back and play the first 5 before you can play Cold Steel 3. And I cannot wait for the default answer when someone asks where to start the series to be as simple as choose your own adventure through the Sky Arc, then do Crossbell, Cold Steel, and Daybreak in that order, and it to be as easy and simple as that. Did any of the Trails in the Sky games actually need a remake? Not at all. They still hold up remarkably well. And the only thing that really needed to happen was them to get ports to modern PlayStation and Nintendo hardware. But a remake is what they decided on, and given what we got, I have to say, that was a pretty good choice too. Honestly, if you're a PC owner, The original first chapter is 20 bucks on Steam and GOG. It regularly goes on sale for 10, and I'm pretty sure I got it for 5. If you're on a tight budget, I obviously recommend the original for that reason, but if you're not, well, we're in the era of standard pricing being 70 bucks for a new game. So instead of dropping that on the latest AAA 6 out of 10 or a game key card of Trails Beyond the Horizon, there's honestly not a lot of harm in just trying both versions of Sky First Chapter, experiencing the game that made me and so many other people start viewing Zemuria as a second home for yourself, and figure out which way you prefer it. I'm just one person who happens to like both ways, but I'm also only one of many people on the internet who will tell you that you need to play Trails at some point during your life. So maybe it's a good idea to start listening to the voices in your head sooner rather than later. There really is no time like the present to get started on this journey. And until the trails we walk cross again, this is Luxon, signing off.